All right, so this is our Unit 1 test review. So if we start with Unit 1, this is, the idea is that this is the foundations of American democracy. So if we start with just what are you remember what are the 5 main ideas of American government? Yeah, popular sovereignty is one.
Is it individualism?
That's something Americans hold.
Consent of the governed?
Yep, consent of the governed. With that we have, which is the part of what does that relate to? What's that agreement? Not natural rights, but what's that agreement? That social contract. Limited government and republicanism. So the idea that the people rule, but in our country that happens through representative democracy, right? Okay. And we have given the government our authority to rule, which is consent of the governed, and therefore we've made a social contract with them. If they break that social contract and they no longer protect our rights, then we have the right to rebel, which is basically what's happened in the Declaration of Independence. Limited government, we set up a government that has checks and balances, a separation of powers, that even the government is under, remember that term we talked about, rule of law, that even the government has to answer. Okay? So those other kind of concepts, separation of powers, checks and balances, this whole kind of Madisonian model. And we have a government that is a republic because a representative democracy, because we didn't really trust that the average person could handle. There's a bit of that distrust. Okay? So then we see these main ideas played out in our country through, we could start if we do, go through our main documents. So this is how my head thought of this, what are the main ideas, and then how does that tie into our documents, and then we'll get into the court cases and those kind of things. So if we start with the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence by Jefferson is really influenced by whose ideas? Locke, who is influenced, he's talking about natural rights, he's talking about the social contract, he's talking about consent of the governed, all of these things. And that we have the right to break away if our rights have been violated. And he lists all those grievances that when he says, one after other, this is what Britain has done, this is what Britain has done. And so we are the United States of America. So then we eventually write our first form of government. We get the Articles of Confederation. So what's the problem? The Articles of Confederation sets up a confederal government. And the problem is that the central government is too what? It's too weak. It can't do the things it needs to. It can't tax. It can't, they can declare war, but where are you going to get the troops from? They can't even raise an army. Remember that it's a unicameral legislature. Okay? You needed a supermajority because it took 9 out of 13 to do anything. And it was unanimous if you actually wanted to change the Constitution. Okay, so that becomes very difficult. Okay? So what shows the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? What big event? Shays' Rebellion. Okay? So Daniel Shays' Rebellion, the farmers who are upset, they go through, they raise Cain, and this really shows that the central government can't handle it if we have any problems. So then we have the Constitutional Convention to try to solve that. Okay? With me so far? So basically this is like chapter 1. And then chapter 2 is these ideas plus the Constitution. And chapter 3 is federalism. This part's pretty simple, right? We're good on this. Okay. So then, let's do this. Okay, so then so with the Constitution, they write a Constitution, So we'll just kind of go through and do each of the articles, like what we have to know with each of them. Does that sound like a good idea? Okay. 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay. Now, the Constitution sets up a federal form of government. And keep in mind that there are two groups. So we have the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. And the Anti-Federalists expressing that through Brutus, right? So the Federalists are saying that all of these factions and divisions within our countries are going to be solved by having a large republic. Now, you remember when we read Brutus, what does Brutus say? That's too big. He says we need to have a small republic because we're too what? We're too diverse, right? Now, ultimately, who wins this argument? The Federalists ultimately win, and what is added to the Constitution to appease the Anti-Federalists? The Bill of Rights. Okay? And the Bill of Rights protect us from the government. That's that whole limited government. Yes? Okay? Now, you're not going to be asked on this test about a lot of specific things about like the First Amendment or anything like that. The one big one that I would really remember is the 10th Amendment, and that's because the 10th Amendment is also something that made the Anti-Federalists happy. The Anti-Federalists, what are they worried about? Yeah, they're worried about a central government that's too powerful. So the 10th Amendment, what does it do? It has reserved powers, powers that are reserved for the states, right? And this was kind of their assurance that, hey, it isn't all just the central government. We are setting aside some powers for the states too. And that was to try to make the Anti-Federalists happy. Okay? So you're going to have something on there that kind of like, what's the main idea? What do the Federalists want? What do the Anti-Federalists want? Okay? All right. That's good. 10th Amendment, that's your big amendment you're going to want to remember. Okay.
Where is national supremacy?
That is in the 6th article. We're going to go over those in just right
So I
now.
was going to say, like, I'm kind of surprised with the Anti-Federalists being king.
They're not. They don't like that. That's the exact point. Like the Anti-Federalists, this scares them. They also don't like, remember that Brutus went on, we didn't read that section, but I told you they really didn't like the necessary and proper clause. It scares the mess out of them. Yeah. Okay? We're okay on that part? I like my new eraser I've discovered. All right, so Article 1 is about the legislative branch, right? So with this, remember, we got to remember our compromises, yes? So I'm going to remember the Great Compromise. What's it also called? Connecticut Compromise, and it sets up a bicameral legislature. Congress, right? And I've got the Senate and the House of Representatives. Now, with this, kind of one of the big important things is the whole idea about what types of powers does Congress have. So Congress has expressed or enumerated powers. And where can I find those? Where am I going to find all these powers, really? Article 1, Section 8, right? So those are the ones that are specifically written down. The power to tax, the power to declare war. Then we've got those implied powers.
Good afternoon, all my Liberty High Schoolians. This is your favorite SRO, Daniel Clark.
And your favorite principal, Miss Kathy Bill.
We've got an announcement to make.
Wait a minute, an announcement? Is everybody listening? Hold on. Corporal Clark has something important.
Oh, wait, hold the phone. If you want to go visit the magical and all-powerful Seth Williams in room 205 this afternoon at this exact time for a quick Q&A session on Power Teacher Pro. Peace out.
There's nobody left who can hear that.
It's teachers. That was for teachers. Sorry, Internet. Okay, so so we have those express powers. One of those express powers is, which is going to come up later for us talking about, is one that the government has used to expand their power greatly, and that's the Commerce Clause, right? So we also have implied powers. Implied powers means that it's not expressly written, but it's that intent. And that's where we get that necessary and proper clause, that Congress can make laws that are necessary and proper to do everything else. We also call it the elastic clause because they have stretched it so far. With me? Okay.
Like all that Congress, that's all things that Congress can do, or is
To undo all the other things. So like a good example is how that the Constitution says that we could create like a Navy, Army, but it doesn't say anything about Air Force. But yet that obviously would be through the elastic clause. That makes sense. But could they create a national bank? That is, of course, McCullough versus Maryland, the Supreme Court says yes, they could. So nowhere in the Constitution did it expressly say that Congress can create a bank. But they can regulate currency. They can check for counterfeiting. Because of that, Congress said, well, in order to do that, it would be helpful if we had a national bank. So we're going to say that creating a bank is part of the necessary and proper clause. It's a power that's not written there specifically, but it's implied that we have it.
So the necessary and proper clause and the elastic clause are the same?
Yes, they are the same thing. These are just two other ways you can. Some people even say and it is implied powers. This is all the same thing.
Do they have restrictions on that?
No, that's the problem. The only restrictions they have is the Supreme Court when they say you've stepped too far. Yes. All right.
Can the Supreme Court only do that when a case comes up?
Yes, Congress can't just pass a law and the Supreme Court is not just sitting there reading every law that comes through. They only do when people bring it to them. Yes, good question. Yep. Okay. All right, so then we have the executive branch, which, of course, is led by the president who makes the laws. How is the president elected? Through the Electoral College. So we're going to talk more about the Electoral College when we talk about the president, but just remember that that's also listed in there. So then we have the judicial branch. And please don't judge my spelling. The big power we need to remember for them is what? Judicial review, which came, of course, through what case, guys? Marbury versus Madison. So that's our big one for that. Okay? So, Lucy H. Jolly Ranchers, that stands for Relationship Between the States. Now, you do not need to remember that it's the fourth article. What you need to remember is what I'm talking about is the full faith and what? Clause. And what does that mean? Contracts and documents have to be recognized from one state to the other. So the Defense of Marriage Act was a violation of this, is what the Supreme Court said in Obergefell versus Hydges. But the full faith and credit clause, this is another kind of, power to the states, but it's the idea you have to recognize from one state to the other. Lucy H. Jolly Ranchers. And so amending the Constitution, you're going to have a question about this. What is the typical way that the Constitution is amended? To happen 26 out of 27 times. 2/3 of Congress passes. And how much of states? 3/4 of state legislatures. So that would be like the Virginia General Assembly passes it, not people. The only time we've used a national convention when the people directly vote was for the repeal of prohibition. Okay? People are like, we're done. Okay?
What is the memorization for these again?
Oh, Lucy eats Jolly Ranchers and cooks rats. I would tell you the ones that are sometimes they'll ask you about Article 6, obviously Article 1. And then if you can remember these, you're going to be okay. They're not going to say, I'm not going to ask on the test, where is amending the Constitution? In which article would I find amending the Constitution? I'm not going to ask that. I'm going to say, how do we typically amend the Constitution? Okay? All right, now this is the big one that you were asking before. So, Cook stands for the Constitution is supreme. So now we're talking about the supremacy clause. So this is a big part of federalism here, because if we go back to that definition of federalism, power is shared between the national and state government, right? With who being supreme? The national government. So the supremacy clause, this is that thing that kind of trumps everything. And this is the issue right now. Like, this will make a good short answer question, like the whole issue with marijuana now. Like, the fact that so many states have legalized recreational and medicinal marijuana, but it's still against the Controlled Substances Act. And the Drug DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, can come in at any time and take that stuff from people, even though the president has said, I'm encouraging you not to. And that's kind of those videos and stuff we watch. That's really kind of the issue. So with the supremacy. So
even the point of the state saying that's okay if really it's illegal and they can't get it.
So, like the Supreme Court, like very interesting, like Clarence Thomas, he's a very anti kind of marijuana, but he said, remember we said one of the advantages of federalism is it allows states to experiment. So we're seeing, before we legalize marijuana nationally, how's it working in Colorado? How's it working in California? So it gives us an idea. States can kind of practice. The reason this has become an issue is because there's actually a federal law that says no. And states went ahead and did them anyway, regardless of the federal law. It's kind of like we go back to the Lopez case. Texas had their law that says we can have guns at school, even though it violated a federal law. And you can do it at a state level until a federal agency comes in and says you're breaking a federal law. Because remember, there's two types of law. Like, we've got state laws that I can break, but we also have federal laws I can break.
So how would the DEA decide which state to go?
That's the whole thing. That's what people are saying. It's very intentional that the DEA suddenly decides to start going in and hassling people. So they've kind of stepped away from the medicinal, and now they're kind of being good. But like we watched that video about Chris, like he had gone for a long time, he hadn't done anything. Then all of a sudden they started cracking down, and they weren't cracking down on the users; they were cracking down on the people who were supplying them. So, yeah. Okay, and the last one is ratification. Do you remember how many states it took to ratify the Constitution? 9. 9 out of 13. Yep. So we're almost done with my list. I have the main ideas, our documents, then the Constitution. That's like the big part of it, and then it's federalism. So let's just talk about federalism. We'll talk about cases, how federalism has increased, what the federal power has increased, and what federalism looks like in America today. This works better than my real eraser on my other whiteboard. Okay, so we have a federal system. We define federalism. You feel good about that, right? So I can choose, how do I be a part of our country? So we have those three terms of a participatory or pluralist or elite. Do you remember these? We also talked about hyperpluralism. Okay, so participatory, this is where you're actually engaged in politics, and it's really kind of individually how I can be. Pluralist is also I'm engaged, but it's through a group. Think about interest groups. Like I gave you the example of how I'm a member of the VEA, the Virginia Education Association. Like that's how I choose one of my ways that I'm politically active, to be participating through that. Remember with the hyper-pluralists, what's the problem with that? They can compete so much that nobody gets heard, right? This kind of idea where everybody's voices are being heard, that's what Madison was talking about. That even though we have factions, that we can come together in a large republic and all get along. The elite, this is only a small group are kind of running everything. Is that kind of how it was at the beginning of our country? Yeah. Remember you had to fit into that white church member, landowning, 21, like that small group. We have expanded democracy as we have continued to exist, and we have increased the amount of people who are able to participate. Okay? That makes sense? That's kind of common sense. All right, so with this and federalism in America, so we talk about we have dual and cooperative, right? So Dual is my layer cake, right? My cake looks a little sad. It's on a plate. Okay. And then I have my marble cake, right? For cooperative. So in dual, it is very clear, like there is a clear division of who's in charge of what. In cooperative, there's a merging, like there's a working together. It's unclear now. There's no longer a clear division. What are we today? Today we are cooperative because there's more sharing. Like a good example of that would be welfare. Welfare for the longest time was the federal arena. Like they were in charge of welfare, states were in charge of education. Now it's both. That's why we're marble now, because it's no longer a clear division. They've passed some of that over to the states because they can't do it all on their own. Make sense? Okay. With that, so when we're thinking about federalism and stuff, fiscal federalism is a very important concept. I have to mention, not just because I like to say it. So remember, that's anything doing with money, right? So what are the two big... So we've got grants, and we have two big types, right? We have block, and we have categorical. Which one do states prefer? Why? They like block. They knew what they want. They're getting a block, a chunk of money. Categorical, it's specific, and that gives more power to the federal government who's saying we're going to give you money, but you have to follow this. Remember that money is one of the ways that the government manipulates the states to get them to do what they want. And when they tell us to do something, that's called a what? A federal mandate. If they say, you have to create this, you have to do this, and typically do they fund these or not? They typically don't fund them. And what's a good example of an unfunded mandate? Yes, the American Disabilities Act, that schools had to make wheelchair access. Okay?
What's the difference? Like, you had federal mandate and mandate on the...
They're really the same thing. I shouldn't have had two. I should have just had federal mandate.
Okay.
But a mandate's whenever you're required to do something. A federal mandate would be from the government.
Okay.
Yeah. That's one of the things I'm going to change when we do this again.
So, for the example, on the full faith and credit clause.
I would say driver's license, like, or a divorce. Like if I get married in Virginia, divorced in Nevada, they're still going to recognize my divorce in North Carolina. The marriage, the Defense of Marriage Act. Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. We're good on money? All that? Okay. How has the federal government gotten more powerful? What are some examples of the growth of federal power? Whenever terrorism, whenever we have a crisis, the Great Depression. So like a question, here's a couple examples of short answer questions. So if I ask you, define federalism, okay, then why would a country choose to be federal? What's an advantage? What's a disadvantage? Remember we said that countries that are large and diverse like them, that a country like China you would think would want to be because it's so large, right? But China wants to keep their power central. And most countries are unitary. So we talked about advantages. We said one was that people can experiment, that it's also very good if you have a diverse population. Do you remember a disadvantage? A big disadvantage is that the inequality is that it's not equal for everybody across. That's a kind of advantage. And remember, these are opposite for unitary.
Yeah.
But that would be a kind of question I'd ask. Define federalism. What's an advantage of federalism? What's a disadvantage? That's how a short answer is modeled, like 3 parts.
And how many short answers?
You're going to do 5, and you're going to have choice. Mm-hmm. Okay. What else want to ask about federal? Oh, so growth of power, we said crisis, things like the Civil War. So I might ask you a question like, give me 3 examples of the growth of federal power. That'd be like 3 parts. So you can also give court cases as an example of growth of federal power, right? So let's finish up here with court cases then. So these are the cases that we have discussed that we need to know. So number 1, of course, we have to know Marbury versus Madison. And why is that one important? Judicial review. So courts have the right to review the constitutionality of things. Okay? Then the next one we talked about was, I never spell this right. I even wrote it down because I never spell it right. McCulloch. M-C-U-L-L-O-C-H. McCulloch versus Maryland. So this is the national bank one, right? So the issues with this is the supremacy clause and that necessary and proper clause. So there's two questions that they were asking. Could they create a bank, a national bank, and could Maryland tax the national government? The Supreme Court says, can Congress create a bank? Yes. Can Maryland tax the national government? No. So that says the national government is supreme.
Why would they tax the national government?
Because they didn't want the bank, so they figured if they taxed them, then they wouldn't put the bank there.
Tax for like property?
Yes, for having a building and a business in their state. They wanted the national government to pay Maryland to have a national building there.
That's an obvious no.
Yeah, right? Today especially, we see it as an obvious no. Okay? So this is that an example of the growth of federal power? Who does this give more power to, the states or the federal government? Federal government, because it says, yes, that necessary proper clause, and hello, supremacy clause. All the things that the Constitution said on paper, remember we talked about this, it's one thing to say something on paper, but then is it actually enforced? So it's one thing to say the national government is supreme, but to actually enforce it, that was a big deal. Okay? So we also talked about Gibbons versus Ogden, which that's the monopoly on the Mississippi, right? The steamboats and the Mississippi River. So this one, here's what you need to remember about Ogden. It relates to the Commerce Clause. That's going to be your question if there's a question. I don't remember if I put one on the test. If I did, it would be like this. Gibbons versus Ogden relates to what? So the Commerce Clause is another way that the federal government has increased their power because they use the Commerce Clause to give themselves more rights. Like, we're going to use the Commerce Clause to stop the monopoly of steamboats on Mississippi. Hey, yay, I think it's a great idea. We're going to use the Commerce Clause to enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Hey, yay, I think that's a great thing too. We're going to use the Commerce Clause to say that you can't have guns in school because it hurts students' education, therefore we're hurting the economy. Yeah, that's a bit of a reach. Okay? All right, so this is another example of power. So our big case that we discussed that's one of our required is, of course, U.S. versus Lopez. So we're talking about the Gun-Free School Zones Act, right? That is passed by Congress. Congress uses to justify what they are doing. Congress's power is limited, right? They can only do what the Constitution says they can do. So they said the Commerce Clause gives us the right to regulate guns in schools. Remember, their kind of big argument is that it negatively affects education, which could then lead to a detriment in our economy. So Lopez in Texas, he has a gun at school. He's 18, but he has a gun. He says, this is faulty logic. This law is a bad law. This law should have never been in effect. And the Supreme Court agrees with Lopez. Okay? Sides with Lopez. Now, here's the big thing. Does this give more power to the states? Yes. That's why this increases state power. That's why this case is in our 15 cases we have to know, because it's a great example of a case that increases state power. Okay? Does that help with Lopez?
Yeah, I was just wondering, so do we need to know each argument that, like, the federal government had against Lopez?
Don't need to. You just kind of a general idea, like what's their justification? Your question is going to be, are we okay with this? So it's going to be just like we did the other day. When you see a court case question, it'll be that kind of A, what's a difference or similarity? And up here, I'm going to give you a case. It will be a case we have not talked about. Okay? I will give you a summary of the case we have not talked about. Then I'm going to ask you a question that's saying what is different or similar. It's probably going to be a similar. Okay? Like what part of the Constitution or whatever. And then the B part, remember that's 1 point. This is the 2-point thing, because you got to give factual information and answer whatever other part of the question, right? So like when we did the Heart of Atlanta case the other day, you had to say why there was different decisions. Why did the Supreme Court say commerce was okay in Heart of Atlanta and why no in Lopez?
So would we just say it was a stretch? Or like how would we say?
You could explain it like that. Like it was a stretch of the Commerce Clause because we weren't talking about trade. Yeah. Like for Heart of Atlanta, some people argue it's a bit of a stretch too, but at least you're talking about actual trade between in business. The Heart of Atlanta. So Heart of Atlanta Motel. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 said that you cannot discriminate in business. So the Heart of Atlanta Motel was not allowing African Americans to stay at their hotel. So they were violating the Civil Rights Act.
So what does that have to do with commerce?
So Congress, again, they can only pass laws that says that they have the right to, right? So they said that the Civil Rights Act, discrimination, and all the different things they put in there is a violation of commerce if we're discriminating against people in business.
Oh, because their business isn't coming in.
And it's interstate, like it's going across several states.
Okay.
And so Heart of Atlanta, they were found guilty of violating the Civil Rights Act, and they challenged, and the Supreme Court sided with the Civil Rights Act and said that Congress had not overstepped its bounds at this time, but in the case of Lopez, they had. And then C always has to do with like somebody making a decision or like a political institution, like how could the president have done something different? How could Congress, that's that part. Okay? And that's basically your test. We're going to have 40 multiple choice questions. You're going to have a couple of graphs, a couple of passages. They also do, there's one other type of question. That's all.